There are some bridges built not with bricks, but with blistered hands, silent prayers, and sleepless nights. In the forgotten corners of the city gasping for hope, a woman stood, abandoned, tired, yet unbroken. Her name was Grace, and though the world had stripped her bare, she clung to one unshakable truth. Her son would not suffer what she had endured. It was a rainy season, and water leaked through the rusted zinc roof of their one-room shack. The cries of a newborn pierced the thick, damp air. Grace held her baby close, wrapping him in a faded shawl that had once been white. The baby's name was John, named not after a hero, but because it was simple, strong, and unburdened by the past. Richard, her husband, stood by the door with a worn bag slung over his shoulder. His eyes, once full of charm, now looked tired and distant. "I can't do this, Grace," he muttered. "I've tried, but there's nothing left in this life for me." Grace didn't beg. She didn't shout. She simply looked at him with hollow eyes and said, "He's your son." Richard's reply was a whisper drowned by the rain. "Let someone else raise him. I have to find my way somehow." And just like that, he disappeared into the storm. Left alone with a newborn and no money, Grace didn't fall apart. She rose. The next day, she found work washing clothes in a nearby compound. It paid little, but it kept John fed. At night, she cleaned shops. Sleep became a luxury, hunger a companion. Yet, she never once considered giving her son away, even when well-meaning neighbors told her to, even when an older widower offered marriage and shelter, even when her hands cracked from cold water and bleach. She would kiss John's forehead every night and whisper, "One day, you'll walk across a bridge I built for you with tears." Years passed like smoke, visible, painful, but quickly gone. Grace didn't mark time with calendars. She marked it with growing feet, school fees, and silent sacrifices. Each time John outgrew his shirt, she wore her old one again. Each time he asked for food, she pretended she'd already eaten. The neighborhood knew her as the woman who never asked for help, but always smiled. But behind that smile was a battlefield, a war she fought daily with faith, grit, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Grace never forgot the night Richard walked away, but she chose not to let her son walk into the same darkness. Instead, she built a bridge, one tear, one struggle, one silent night at a time. And as John slept peacefully beside her, unaware of the battles won on his behalf, Grace whispered again, "One day you'll understand." 10-year-old John was no longer the giggling baby Grace once cradled in her arms. He was growing fast, taller, sharper, more observant. His eyes, once filled with nothing but wonder, had begun to ask silent questions, questions that words couldn't always answer. He began to notice the peeling paint on their walls, the patched-up sandals he wore to school, the way other children had lunchboxes filled with snacks, while his mother wrapped a piece of dry bread in brown paper and called it special. He didn't complain, not yet, but the shame started to simmer in his chest like an untamed flame. At school, his classmates laughed behind his back. One day, a boy pointed at his shirt, faded and slightly too small, and snickered, "Your mum shops at the dustbin." The laughter was cruel, cutting into John's heart like a blade. He clenched his fists, but said nothing. Instead, he came home quiet that day. Grace noticed. "John, what happened at school?" she asked gently, her hand scrubbing stubborn stains from the floor. "Nothing," he mumbled, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Grace wanted to press further, but she held back. She knew what it meant to be ashamed of not having enough. But what pained her most wasn't his silence. It was knowing she was doing everything she could, and it still wasn't enough. She had already sold half her clothes, keeping only 2 faded dresses for herself. The nicer ones had fetched just enough for John's textbooks. She skipped breakfast daily, sometimes dinner too, pretending she was just not hungry. When John asked if she had eaten, she would smile and say, "I ate earlier, my dear. You eat first." At night, when John was asleep, Grace would sit near the window, looking at the stars with cracked glass pane. She would whisper to God, plead for strength, and cry without a sound. But always, in the morning, she rose again, ready to give more than she had. Despite the hardship, John was brilliant. He soaked up knowledge like a sponge, often finishing his homework before others had even understood the questions. His teachers noticed. His headmistress even called Grace once, praising his performance. Grace beamed with pride but said humbly, "It's all God." One afternoon, John came home with a letter. A scholarship was being offered by a mysterious education foundation. Full tuition, uniforms, even meals. The catch? Only one student would be selected from the school. "Ma, do you think I can get it?" John asked, his eyes wide with hope. Grace placed her hands on his shoulders and smiled. "You were born for more, my son. If this is God's will, it will be yours." But even as she smiled, her heart clenched. What if he wasn't chosen? How would she keep affording his education? A few days later, a neighbor named Mr. Ade, who worked at the town's electrical supply shop, knocked on their door. He handed Grace a small bag of rice and a bar of soap. "You've done well, Grace," he said softly. "The boy's sharp, if you ever need." "I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "God is helping me." He nodded but didn't press. He had long admired Grace, not just for her beauty, which hardship had not dimmed, but for her resilience, her dignity, and the love she poured into her son like rain into thirsty ground. That night, after feeding John the last bit of rice and stew, Grace told him she had already eaten. He believed her, as always. But deep in the night, John stirred. He heard muffled sobs coming from the small corner where Grace kept her pillow. Carefully, he crept closer and saw her, kneeling, her hands clasped tightly, her lips moving in whispers. "God, I've done all I can. I don't know how much more I can carry. Richard, wherever you are, come and see your son." John froze. He had never heard that name before. "Richard?" he whispered under his breath. 1,000 questions swirled in his head, but he quietly tiptoed back to bed, heart pounding. Something had just changed, and John knew it. At 16, John had outgrown his school uniform, but not his hunger to learn. His dreams had grown louder, filling his mind with machines' codes and blueprints. He spent hours sketching designs for inventions, solar-powered cooking pots, water-purifying systems, and even a small windmill built from scrap. He longed to study engineering, to fix things, not just with tools, but with ideas. But he kept these dreams locked inside. Every time he looked at his mother, thin, worn, her hands rough from cleaning floors and washing clothes, he swallowed his ambition. He couldn't burden her with something so big, not when she was already carrying so much. Grace, on the other hand, had noticed a shift in him. His eyes sparkled when he talked about science or when he took apart broken radios and fixed them again. She saw it, but she never asked. She feared the answer might be something she couldn't afford. When John got accepted into a local polytechnic, Grace didn't show her fear. She smiled, praised God, and started looking for a second job. Days were already tough, but nights became harder. She picked up work cleaning offices after hours, dragging herself home at midnight, with aching bones and swollen feet. She told John the new job was just to save a little more, but she never mentioned the dizzy spells, the chest tightness, or the way her vision sometimes blurred when she stood too quickly. Meanwhile, John met someone who would change his life. Mr. Felix, a retired engineer who volunteered part-time at the community library. Felix noticed John's sketches and asked to see more. He was impressed and offered to mentor him. But there was a catch. "Talent is good," Felix said, tapping one of John's designs. "But you'll need real tools, proper software, and a laptop to take this further. Are you able to get them?" John smiled politely and nodded, though he knew the answer was no. At home, he stared at Grace one night as she massaged her feet. Her shoulders slumped as she tried to smile. He couldn't ask her for a thing, so John made a decision. He found a job helping out at a roadside mechanic shop after school. It was dirty work, but he learned fast, and they paid him just enough to start saving. He didn't tell Grace. Instead, he made excuses for coming home late. Extra study, he said. Group work. But secrets have a way of unraveling. One night, Grace collapsed in the office bathroom. A co-worker rushed her to the local clinic, where she was diagnosed with exhaustion and low blood pressure. When John received the call and rushed there, his heart broke. She looked so small in that hospital bed, tubes attached to her arm, her skin pale. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, tears filling his eyes. Grace forced a smile. "Because I knew you'd stop dreaming." John blamed himself. His silence, his ambitions. He thought they had pushed her over the edge. When she came home, she acted like nothing had happened, sweeping the floor and humming to hide the pain. John began cooking more, watching over her, pretending he wasn't worried. But every night, he added a few more coins to the jar under his bed. Weeks passed, and then came the big moment. Mr. Felix submitted John's latest design to a national engineering competition without telling him. It was a model for a low-cost solar panel system that could power homes in rural areas. The judges loved it. John was selected to represent their region at the national level. His joy was indescribable, but it was quickly dampened by reality. The trip required travel to another state, accommodation, food, registration fees, all costs that had to be covered up front. He would also need Grace's written approval to travel with the team. John stood outside their small home that evening, gripping the acceptance letter, his heart thumping. How could he ask his mother, already broken from sacrifice, for permission to chase a dream that might cost him everything? He took a deep breath, walked in, and said, "Ma, there's something I need to tell you." The moment John placed the competition letter on the table, Grace didn't need to read it to know it was something important. His eyes shimmered with both hope and hesitation, as if afraid of what she might say. "Ma," he began softly, "I've been selected for a national competition. It's a big deal, but I'll need to travel. There's a fee, and Before he could finish, Grace reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "You're going," she said firmly. John blinked. "But Ma, we can't." "You're going," she repeated, smiling, though a storm brewed quietly behind her eyes. "God didn't bring you this far to stop now." John hugged her tightly, unable to speak. Later that night, while John slept, Grace opened a small wooden box beneath her bed. Wrapped in cloth was the last thing of real value she owned, her mother's wedding ring. A thin band of gold, worn but precious. It had been passed down through generations. She ran her fingers over the smooth metal, tears in her eyes. "Mama, forgive me," she whispered, "but this is the only way." The next morning, she visited the gold merchant at the edge of the market. The money was just enough to cover John's fare, accommodation, and a little extra for food. She returned home with a tired smile and handed John an envelope. "It's taken care of," she said, brushing his hair with motherly pride. "Go and make me proud." John couldn't find the words to thank her. He promised himself he would win, not for the trophy, but for her. And win he did. At the National Engineering Competition, John stunned the judges with his invention, a cost-effective solar energy system for low-income communities. He spoke with confidence, passion, and clarity. His solution was not only innovative, but deeply rooted in real struggle, real stories, his own. When his name was announced as the winner, the crowd erupted in applause. John stood on stage, holding the trophy high, his heart pounding like a drum. Cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. A journalist asked, "What inspired your project?" John glanced into the lens and smiled faintly. "My mother. She gave up everything so I could dream. Everything I am is because of her." "Your father?" another asked. John hesitated, just for a moment, then said softly, "He passed away a long time ago." He didn't look at the camera after that. The interview aired nationwide. Back at home, Grace sat alone on her old couch, watching the broadcast with trembling hands. When John spoke about her, her eyes welled up with tears and a proud, quiet smile crept across her face. "My son," she whispered. But the media wasn't done. The story of the boy from poverty who had built a life-saving invention captured hearts and headlines. One newspaper, digging deeper, discovered John's birth certificate, his father's name, Richard. A follow-up article printed Richard's recent struggles. Once a successful trader, Richard had lost everything to debt and poor choices. Now, he worked as a night guard at a warehouse on the other side of the state. The news eventually reached Richard. He stared at the newspaper, his hands trembling. The boy in the picture looked familiar. His jawline, his eyes, his name. John. My son, he muttered. Unable to resist, Richard tracked down the school's contact details and placed a call. Hello, I'm trying to reach John, he said nervously. Tell him his father wants to speak with him. The secretary took the message. But when Grace visited the school later that week, she intercepted it. Her heart froze as she read the note. She tucked it silently into her bag and said nothing to John. That night, after he had gone to bed, Grace pulled out an old envelope from the bottom of her wooden chest. Faded and yellowing, it was addressed in delicate handwriting. To my beloved Richard. She held it for a long while, tears rolling down her cheeks. And just before sunrise, John awoke with a thirst and went to the kitchen. As he passed her room, the door was slightly ajar. He saw her sitting by the oil lamp, holding the letter. Curious, he waited until she fell asleep, then tiptoed in. His eyes caught the name on the envelope, Richard. His breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled as he reached for the letter. Stay tuned for the part 2. Please subscribe to my channel to ensure you don't miss out on future updates. Thank you for your support.